So this is part three of our vegetation notes, and we had talked about the whole Madro-Tertiary geoflora and the Arcto-geoflora as being Arcto-Tertiary geoflora as being um, major sources of our vegetation. And we did emphasize early on the Madro-Tertiary, but now we're going to look at a region where that's only a fairly minor part of the plants that we find, especially trees. And so let's pick it up right here where I think we left off. And temperature fluctuations in the past 3 million years have caused interregional migrations of species, resulting in great diversity in the Klamath Mountains region. In that region, and that's in southern Oregon, a little bit in northern California, uh, primarily southern Oregon, topographic, climatic, and edaphic, or in other words, soil diversity, have also contribute to the great species diversity there. The Klamath Mountains is kind of famous for this diversity. We're going to see some examples of that in a video later about fire, and we'll see some familiar trees by then when we get to that. So that's coming up. But I just wanted to highlight this. That is like the biggest, most diverse region in terms of vegetation in the Pacific Northwest. And largely, it's just that there's a lot of topography that different elevations and also different slopes, north slopes being cooler, south slopes being warmer, and so on. And that leads to different microclimates. But also, you have the kind of coastal side of that region, which is much wetter, and then in the interior, it's quite dry and much hotter. So you have this enormous diversity in the region because of that. So that is just a tiny bit about that region. What I want to do now is come down and we'll work our way down to the part of our notes where we're going to talk about succession now. You might recall succession was one of the factors in understanding what grows where. So in succession, what we're saying, it's just a somewhat predictable replacement of species within a plant community with time. And the way it's usually described, it doesn't have to be this way, but typically it works out this way, is that there are pioneer species. So when there's a major disturbance, whether it's say a big fire or an insect destruction of entire forest stands, which we're going to look at later, or whether it's a big wind blowdown, a major clear-cutting logging operation, whatever it is that disturbs the site, then you have to start over. And when you start over, you'll see some fairly predictable things happen in most areas. And so we'll describe that for the kind of coastal rainforests a little later. Okay, so those come in first, and then eventually you'll get several species that will become more dominant. And so those early ones are the pioneers. Gradually are reduced in number, while the Cerro ones, although they were present from the beginning, become more dominant. And then finally, you end up with climax species that can regenerate themselves indefinitely under fairly constant environmental conditions. Okay, so the idea of the climax kind of steady state species again assumes no huge major disturbance. But that's a bit of a challenge to find places where that happens, and so we're going to address that a little later here a bit. So let's first start kind of regionalizing vegetation in the Pacific Northwest, and we'll use then those successional concepts. First thing to say is talk just a tiny bit about alpine or high altitude vegetation. These are areas where the vegetation is stunted or where they're treeless, and if they're below 7,000 feet, it's probably more because of wind than it is temperature. Above 7,000 feet, generally in the region of the Pacific Northwest, it can be just so cold and covered with snow. Obviously, you're not going to get much to grow there if that's the case year round in areas right around glaciers or under glaciers, of course. So that's just a tiny bit about that. Wind blasting is really, really amazing in exposed mountains at higher elevations, and the blowing of the snow particles at 40 or 50 mile an hour winds is incredibly abrasive, and it's hard for anything to grow. So what does grow kind of grows along the ground, very stunted, and often under the initial layer of snow. So those are kind of unique environments. Not to spend a lot of time on that, but just to mention that. But where I want to really start is out in the west. We're gonna look at the Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and a little bit California coastal forests at low elevations. Let's start there. And so the Cerro, if you start over in these areas, and let's say that you have a major fire like the Tillamook burn in the 30s, and later there's actually several episodes of those. Fire is actually fairly rare in these regions, but it does happen, and so I didn't put Pioneer there per se. But I mean, if you look at a logging operation where they've done more of unless a clear cut, first thing that pops up everywhere is weeds, grasses, stuff that can handle the very stressful conditions. Now you don't have shade anymore along the ground. It's very sunny for much of the day. The summers are very dry because of full sun, and because summers are dry even in this region by and large. And so you get lots of annual plants, flowering plants. You get Scotch broom, which is an invasive species from somewhere else. And you'll get a few alder starting right away, and some of these other trees are like Douglas fir, shore pine, Sitka spruce, depending on where you are. But really, this pretty soon Cerro becomes the sort of the dominant vegetation as the trees grow up pretty quickly, and very often Douglas fir is the dominant one in these areas. Or if you're in streamside areas or steep slopes, sometimes alder competes heavily with Douglas fir. Very, very near the shore, you'll see Sitka spruce, and they can continue to dominate, or you'll see shore pine. Let's just have a look at some of these now, kind of get ourselves familiar with them, okay? So this is shore pine, and shore pines tend to be found in the sandy areas of the coastal zone mostly, and they seem to do better there. Sandy soils don't hold a lot of moisture, so they have some advantages in that summer drought. They tend to be kind of low trees. Pinus contorta, they're called because of the contorted kind of look that you see here. And like probably the nearest to where you are, if you're in the Willamette Valley, where you'd see a lot of these, would Pacific City is kind of the classic environment for those. If you've been up to Pacific City along the coast, just north a bit of Lincoln City, maybe 13 miles north of Lincoln City, something like that, you'll see lots of these, and they tend to be in beach and near beach areas, mostly in sandy habitats. And they have maybe another look at these. They're actually genetically very similar to the lodgepole pine, which is up in more mountainous areas. So those are the two habitats. But basically, shore pine is this particular variety of lodgepole that grows near the beach. Okay, so that's one. The other ones we mentioned, red alder, is a tree that kind of have these trunks. They're kind of whitish, grayish. They're a deciduous tree. A little bit about deciduous. That just means it loses its leaves. So far, we've been just talking about mostly coniferous trees or needle leaf trees that have cones. But deciduous trees lose their leaves. They'll be like maples, beech, in this case, the alders, aspens are really very closely related tree, and so on. Okay. Now, these alders grow really, really fast, and they are a very strong seral species. I want to show you, I got another one of those, actual photo. This is very near Cascade Head. These are recently emerged, probably a decade old, maybe. They grow really, really fast, and they're very good at, they have nitrogen fixing nodules in their roots that fix nitrogen from the air. And nitrogen, if you know anything about farming or gardening, you know is limiting supply in almost any ecosystem. And so they're a great fertilizer kind of tree. Now, what you see here as well, you look at these are needle leaf coniferous trees. What are those? Those are Sitka spruce, real common in this habitat as well. And I don't know why those particular ones don't have the branches near the ground. I don't know if it's because of the elk trimming them a little bit. I don't know. They're not really like favorites of elk, but maybe when they were real young sprigs they did, or maybe someone pruned these off. This is near a roadside, so I'm a little puzzled by that myself. But so in any case, these are real common competitors. As you can see, the alders are growing faster, and they're shading out these Sitka spruce, although they're on the edge here, so they'll have some light from being on the edge, which will help them survive. But the alder can grow really fast, 50, 60 years. Okay, so looking at some of the other trees in this environment, this is the Sitka spruce, kind of classic Sitka spruce look of a very mature forest habitat. This is up just south of Cascade Head on the Central Oregon coast, and this just shows these enormous trees. They are they do handle high winds well. They're salt air adapted. They're definitely a very much a coastal species. You can find a few of them in interior valleys, but dominantly they're coastal. And let's see. I also want to show you. This is a classic Douglas fir. I mean, Douglas fir is the most important tree in the Pacific Northwest. If you want to talk about timber value, look at the size of that one. We don't have too many that big anymore, but really amazing, really large trees, and still used for framing houses. A very common use for those. The other ones, let's see. Oh, this is kind of a fun one to look at. This is a little promotional flower for the Quinault Valley up in that's the Olympic rainforest up in northwest Washington State. This is Olympic National Park. You can see it highlighted there, and this is the Quinault River. And so if you want to see some of the world's biggest coniferous trees, you go there. In fact, I had planned a trip the third day of the term. I was going to run up. It was really sunny, and I got too busy. So I was going to bring you some photos up there. Been a long time since I've been up that far north on the coast. But in any case, yeah, so these are, like the Sitka spruce has got an enormous one there, a large Doug fir and so on, Douglas fir. Okay, so let's go back to the notes. With Climax then, so if what happens is if you have these trees growing long enough in an area, they'll get taller and taller and taller. And the problem then becomes if you're a new tree wanting to emerge, you have to be able to grow in shade because as you saw, those alders were shading out, or trying to shade out the Sitka spruce already in that particular photo I showed you a few moments ago. And so what happens though is, although these are the trees that start out, and these are usually shore areas where the other trees are never going to dominate because of shifting sands and so on. But if you start out with these, they start to shade, and what happens is if you're going to be a newly growing tree in that environment, a shade tolerant tree at a young age is what you want, and those tend to be western hemlocks and western red cedars. Now, they are not as good at competing. Neither one of these are as good at competing in a kind of environment of recently disturbed where you have these really rapidly growing alders and Douglas fir. They don't compete as well in that stressful, very sunny, cleared environment. And so what happens is you just don't see very many of them. But then once these canopies grow up here in this coastal region or near coast, kind of coast hills and so on. What happens is the Douglas fir, they're not very shade tolerant. They can't grow. They don't start anymore. The ones that, not as seedlings. And the alders don't do so well either unless they're right along a stream area where there's kind of fairly constant shifting banks and erosion and landslides and so on. And the spruce even, they're somewhat shade tolerant, but not as shade tolerant as these two. So if you get a really dense canopy going in the Cerro stage, the trees that are creating the shade themselves can't regenerate themselves. So then the ones that are really good in the shade, the western hemlock and the western red cedar, grow. Now the Douglas fir will still be really important here because they're a fast grower and they're competitive, and they'll still be a large part of the environment, but they are not really very good at growing up in shade, so they won't be the newly sprouted ones. You won't see those so much. Okay, I'm going to just show you real quickly one example. Let's see. This would be like a western hemlock here. And interesting, these tend to grow up in stumps or nurse logs as well. And then the red cedar, That's what those look like. Okay, so we'll talk a bit more about that in the next episode.